Hey there, welcome to another episode of the Tile Confidential podcast. And in this episode, we are going to talk about how to choose tile colors based on LRV. Okay, so if you are watching this on YouTube, you're going to probably see some of the images that we're going to talk about. It's probably the ideal place to view this podcast episode. Otherwise, if you're watching it or listening to it on Spotify, you still get a pretty decent amount of information that you can maybe later on review on the YouTube episode. But it would be good for you to kind of get an idea about uh, what I'm talking about when I show you some of the images in this episode. So let's get right into it. So the goal of this episode, is to talk about LRV, obviously, but the agenda for today is going to be going into depth and talking about also, what are the LRV values. What is LRV to begin with? We're going to talk about that and where we're going to find these values and how it kind of relates to tile. Um, One of the things that I sometimes think about is that there's different kinds of worlds out there that don't necessarily talk to each other. And very interesting that the LRV, which we'll get into talking about what that is, it comes from the paint world. I don't think I've ever been into a tile store that they bring up the subject, or at least when they're helping you select tile, they talk about, let's look at the LRV of the color of the tile that you're selecting and make sure that it's going to be suitable for a particular space. I mean, that's what I do at our store in Bella Tiles. But in most places, I don't see that. But if you walk into a paint store, you do actually see, they talk about LRV. They will even bring it up and mention that, what's your lighting like? I mean, they're helping you select a paint color. So it actually comes from the paint world. And I have this little image here as a kind of a joke to talk about how when two different worlds meet, they can really lead to a different way of thinking or a different kind of innovation or sometimes even a better approach to serve the customers. And that's really what this is about. Is I try to think about different ideas in different realms that don't necessarily have collided much. And if you want to think about thinking a little bit outside the box or innovation in any area, it's good to look at combining worlds that maybe otherwise have not necessarily collided before. And so what this is about here, this image here, is kind of a caricature of what I'm trying to say. Is we have the Aliens trilogy, and in one of the movies, the Prometheus, where the one of the characters in the movie, an engineer meets a trilobite, and these two aliens basically get into a bout, and eggs are laid. And so if you're familiar with the Alien movie, you probably know this. But it lays eggs into the engineer, and out of that comes out this Deacon, which is a much more advanced alien species. So it's sort of trying to characterize what I'm trying to say is what I hope that you're going to see from this episode is that we can take what's in the paint world and bring into the tile world, and also be able to help our customers select tile in a different way with a different way of thinking about it, and it actually helped them create more beautiful spaces. So that's really the goal here. So let's talk about what LRV is here, because I'm sure if you're not familiar with the term, you're dying to know what that means. So it comes from the paint world, as I mentioned, not the tile world. And you want to think about it like this: you ever painted a room, and later on, you realize that the room is quite dark, or maybe the opposite. Maybe it's really bright and you're not really satisfied. That's not what you were thinking when you're selecting the tile as the paint color at the paint store. But when you brought it up and you painted a space, now it's not necessarily what you thought. And sometimes you end up repainting the entire room in a different color because of that. Um, that's really actually what's happening is that um, the lighting in your space affects uh, quite substantially the color that you're going to see reflecting off of that space. And LRV stands for the light reflectance value. And every color has its own light reflectance value. And most paint manufacturers will give you that value actually based on their paint color. And we'll talk about where you're going to find that. And actually, I have a little tip for you, later on in this episode, how you can kind of an easy way for you to identify the LRV of any color on any surface, and it'll be kind of fun to do yourself as well. So that's what LRV is, and really what it is. It refers to how light or dark a paint color will look on a scale that is from 0, which is black, and 100, which is white. We're just getting into a little bit of color, the science of color. The way we see color is based on what is reflected back into our in our eyes. So any surface that has any color, the color that we're seeing is the range within the spectrum, the spectrum of light that in obviously in the color section of the spectrum that reflects back into our eyes, and that's what we're seeing. Essentially, that's the color we're seeing. And the higher the LRV, the number is, the lighter the color is. The lower the LRV is, the darker the color is. And as we get in towards colors like very dark color or even black, that's really like no light is being reflective off of that. If you want to think about like a black hole, the reason in space, the reason black holes are black is because light cannot escape from the black hole, which is why we cannot ever see what's inside the black hole. In the case of like an LRV that's 100, you basically the entire spectrum of the light is being reflected back. So again, you're seeing a complete overlap of all the colors, and that's why you see white here. So that's what basically LRV is, and it can really greatly affect your room. Depending on how much natural or artificial light that you might have that it gets. One thing you want to understand is that any color will look lighter when it's hit with a direct or artificial light, but different colors will respond differently. So that's really where LRV becomes very important in when we're talking about colors. And in this episode, we're going to be shifting gradually, talking about color with respect to tile, not necessarily paint, but I just wanted to tell you where that comes from. It comes from the paint world. So one very important thing to understand about this subject of the LRV is that if you don't have enough light in the space, it doesn't matter the LRV of that color, you're not going to be able to even create the kind of lighting that you want to create. So LRV is not about necessarily creating extra light in the space. It's about enhancing the color and allowing it to reach its potential of what what the value of that is, and reach the color potential. That's really what it is. So I have two images here, as you can kind of see, and we'll talk about more examples later on in case studies. But you can see here like a very kind of a dark color tile in the top left corner, and what that is basically it's soapstone looking like tile, but look at the amount of lighting that they put in there, because it is a shower and they want to make sure they have enough lighting in there. And so you can see all the different reflections off of that light. There must be a lot of lights, especially pot lights, I can see in that space. So they're trying to really brighten up the space because they know that that room is going to be really dark as a result of those dark tiles. So how do you decide on how much light is good? You want to think about it in terms of rationality. If you have a bathroom and you maybe going to have like two pot lights on the ceiling and that's it as far as lighting. Well, this is where the problem is going to create, because you're going to see a lot of shadows in different corners. Pot lights are kind of a cone shape type of lighting. They're directional, coming from the ceiling down. And they're going to create a lot of shadows. So you want to make sure that you have maybe another type of light on the wall to create, add some reflective value over on the walls, maybe like a sconce or a vanity light, something to kind of create a directional light from a different direction, so that these kind of shadows are not created. Because what that shadows basically do is take away the sort of the normal amount of lighting that should be in that space. So that's really what you want to think about, is you want to have enough lighting, and is it a subjective term, but you want to have enough lighting. Because if there's enough, there's light in your room, the light there will reflect off of the paint. And if you pick like a light color, which is essentially going to have a high LRV, and you don't give it enough light to reflect on, it won't really do its job. So that's really what you're trying to do. The light is basically the most important part of this whole thing process. So when we think about LRV, I kind of categorize it here based on different values. I mentioned they go from 0 to 100. And we're going to be talking now more about the tiles. So if you're thinking about like dark colored tiles, are going to have LRV values between 0 and 20. Medium colored tiles, again, we're getting a little bit lighter than, so we're still in the darks, but medium. Maybe we're talking about darker, like just the browns or the beiges, or colors where it's not completely black, but it's like, getting into like the slates and stuff like that. So 20 to 50 usually. And then the light colored tiles are going to be like 50 to 75. And then we have the off-whites, which is pretty popular these days. Sometimes people don't want pure white in their space. They want something white, but that kind of complements some of the other things they have in your space. The 75 to 80, these are the tiles that are going to have that high reflective value to them. And then you got the white tiles, which are going to be like 80 plus. So that's basically like the categories of the tiles here. These categories that I have here is not like pure science where it's like it's supposed, this is the numbers. These are numbers or ranges that, based on some information that I've looked at with the paints, and I see kind of where they kind of sit. So that's where I kind of group them. But I think it's pretty accurate as far as the categories that most paint colors fall in. So we can use this to think about the tiles. And when we're selecting tile, we say to yourself, okay, well, what kind of lighting do we have in that space? Because sometimes you don't have full control over changing the lighting. Let's say you have, decent amount of lighting, not to the extent it's a lot, but it's decent, and you're not really changing the lighting in that space. But you don't want the bring in colors that are going to turn dark or not have a very high reflective value, as a result, not really give the color that they should be in that kind of space. So that's when you kind of go with a higher LRV valued color tiles in those kind of spaces. In contrast, you might be in a space where there might be too much lighting. You got big windows, skylights, pot lights, all kinds of lighting, and maybe their lights don't have dimmers on them. So when you turn the lights, the whole place just brightens up too much. Well, those are the kind of situations where you want to say, okay, well, we need to tone it down a bit. And if we're bringing in like whites in there, well, it's going to reflect a lot, and it's going to have that really kind of hospital look where everything is just too white, and you walk in and it can be kind of a turn off to kind of walk into a space that's just too bright. So that's when you kind of look towards toning it down a bit by using the color of the tile that you're going to be putting on the walls, on the floors, especially floors. So this is sort of where I wanted to kind of discuss with in terms of the categories. Um, So let's get into discussing these particular categories a little bit more in detail, and then that we get a better idea of how they respond in different spaces. So let's talk about 0 to 20 dark color tiles. So these color tiles, the colors of these tiles that are between that range, are going to have obviously a low LRV and reflect some light, uh, but not a lot. Basically, they're more about absorbing light than anything else. So that earlier example, I talk about a very highly bright room. These are kind of color tiles you want to kind of go for because they're going to absorb a lot of that light, um, and reflect less back into the room. As the number goes up, so it gets closer to 20, it's going to reflect more. So if you really need to absorb a lot of light, you want to stay even closer to between 0 and 10. But that's in a super bright room, these colors they do great. They appear lighter, and you actually notice their colors better too as a result of that. So that's another interesting thing about these tiles is that um, you kind of get to see the undertone of these tiles a lot better because they're the amount of light in there so much that it's really that kind of color demands more light in order to see it. The other interesting thing is that if you have specific patterns or textures on the tile, they're going to be noticed much more in these kind of situations. So that's in a bright room. In a dark room, unfortunately, these colors are not going to do very well. So if I would take word of caution, if you're using these dark colors in a kind of a dimly lit room with not enough lighting, or not enough lighting coming from multiple directions, that's another one as well. These are not going to be the best choice, and you're not going to necessarily see the print as great on the tile, or even if there's any patterns or anything, you're not going to really see it well. So word of caution, if you're going to be using these tiles in dark, like not so great lit spaces. So the next category is the 20 to 50 that I have here, the medium color tiles. And basically they tend to hold themselves, these tend to hold themselves a bit better in dark environments. So if you have a kind of like and again, not so great lit space, and you don't have control over changing lighting, and you do want to go with darker tones, these are the tiles that you want to choose, not the 0 to 20, because they're going to hold better. You're going to be able to see the patterns better, and they're not going to, at the same time, uh, absorb as much light. They also do pretty well in super bright rooms. So they're kind of in a way, as far as like the dark tones is concerned, they're kind of in the middle, because they do pretty well in a very high bright room as well, because they don't reflect as much light, so you still get a pretty good balance between lighting and color, and being able to see the pattern and everything on the tile as well. The next category, to 50 to 75, these are the light colors. Now we're kind of getting in towards away from the darks, and we're getting into sort of the higher LRV values. Remember, this is sort of like the 3/4 of the way kind of range as far as LRVs. So we're going to expect that the spaces that we're going to be putting these, we are going to reflect quite a bit of light into those spaces. These are going to have a lot of the um, lighter tones of the colors that we might be seeing in the dark or medium color tile. So if it's blue, if it's red, we're going to see the lighter version of those colors in this category. And in a kind of a light room, or sorry, actually like a bright room, you're going to you're going to see these tiles, excuse me, in the lighter room. These tiles are going to reflect quite a bit of light, and they're going to enhance the lighting in a room, and actually expose the color tones inside them as well. So that's the nice thing. But they're a bit stepped down from the off-whites. So think about the off-whites just being basically mostly white with a light tone color difference between them. These are still colors, but they're going to enhance the space. And one of the interesting things about them is that if your space is going to be utilizing a lot of tiles in that space, let's say we're working with blue tiles, you're going to add a lot of color reflectance of that blue back into that space as well. So something to consider is if you want to bring for instance, a blue hue into that room, and you're using, let's say, glossy ceramic tiles, wall tiles in the shower, you have to remember that's an important element to consider, that you're going to reflect that color back into every part of that space. And also, as someone walking into that room, your eyes are going to pick up a lot of that blue as well. So that's the benefit of these, is that you can really play with the color of the lighting that you want to bring in that room, you using these 50 to 75 range kind of light LRV color tiles. So now we're going to get into like the off-whites and the whites. These are tiles basically that the highest LRV that you're going to be able to find. And the thing to really consider is that you want to make sure that you're not creating a space that it's too bright. That's the thing that you want to really consider with this. So tile colors with high LRV will have a potential to reflect a lot of light. But we have to remember, if you don't give them enough light, they're not going to really do much. So they still do work well in dimly lit spaces as well, because although their LRV is fairly high, they're just not going to reflect a lot of light. They look a lot brighter than they do if the space is like really well lit. There's a lot of lighting, and they're not going to look their optimal color in dim space. Something to consider. And in a very lit room, sometimes they can kind of flash too much light into adjacent areas of that room. So that's something else to consider as well, is that they kind of take away any shadows. Sometimes shadows can kind of create a nice feature in a space, having some shadows, but these colors can sometimes completely take away from that, and it kind of makes it look a little bit monotoned, if you know what I mean. In a kind of a poor lit room, they are going to look quite flat, because again, there's not enough light for them to reflect. And but you can kind of supplement that a bit by adding some other types of colors, and because it will come out like a little bit more flat. By adding some other colors in that space, you can kind of make the place look pretty good without all the lighting that you might need to bring that color out. So that's something else to consider. They also respond really well with natural light. So one of the things about these off-whites is that they really enhance the space quite well with regards to natural light versus the other LRV values. So that's something that if you have a lot of natural light in a space, it'd be good to use some of the off-white tiles or even the white tiles in that space, because natural light tends to have a lot more kind of a different degrees in its the Kelvin value, the temperature value of the light, versus like indoor artificial light. Although with artificial light, remember, you can control that. It can be like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, but natural light tends to change throughout the day You have to remember that as well. So you might, in the morning time, you might be a different temperature than in the light than it is in the evening time. So having these off-white tiles can offset that a bit and not let that change the look in the space too much, because again, they reflect a lot of light. So as we go into the evening time and the temperature of the light that's being coming in from outside changes, that's not going to be as much of an issue. So that's very important. So this is the kind of thing that we want to consider when we're selecting. So I kind of went over that with you guys here with regards to high LRV values. So let's get into the fun part here. How do you measure the LRV of a tile color? And the easiest way that you can go about this is to download the Benjamin Moore app. I don't have any affiliation with Benjamin Moore. I love their product. Just the only paint brand that I use. But um, in their app, they have this feature where you can take a picture of a space. So in the case where we're talking about a tile, you can pick up the tile, take a picture of the tile, and then you can use that picture in their app. You tap on that color, and at the bottom, what it comes is a bunch of their colors that your camera has picked up, and you select the one that's closest to that tile, and then you're going to see a sticker that basically is going to show the LRV of that tile. So that's really what's important here is we want to see what the LRV is of the tile, and the best way is you just take a picture and then match it up with the color, the paint color, and then you're going to be able to see the LRV. And then you can make a decision from there on based on how's the lighting in their room, how much natural light, how much artificial light, what are we trying to do, what's the goal here, and enhance the space for the client that you're trying to serve. So that's the one way to do it. The other way is, you can just go on and you can use the fan decks that different manufacturers provide. So Sherwin-Williams has one, all these other brands, Valspar, Kelly-Moore, but you can carry that fan deck with you and then, look for the one that matches it. And then, Benjamin Moore has the website too. You can go on their website and look at the LRV. But I think the app approach is a way easier because you already have your phone with you. Just as easy as just grab, your phone, take a picture, tap on the color of the tile that's closest on their options that they offer you. Boom, you got the LRV value. Okay. All right. Now we're going to get into some case studies, and we're going to look at this, and we're going to dive more deeper into the tile side of this whole discussion, because when we talk about paint, we're not. There's a lot of things that's missing here. Texture, tiles have things like texture. We have glossiness. We have size, we have grout joints, we have so many things that we have to consider that it also affects the light reflectance value, the LRV of the tile itself. So here we are looking at some pictures of tiles that are in different type of lighting conditions, but also one thing very important to look at is that, for instance, the top left tile, the tile on the left hand side, and the bottom right tile. These are ceramic tiles with kind of a rippled effect pattern on them, and this is a feature on the tile. If you want to really bring that out, it's very important to really have good lighting in that space. Otherwise, if the lighting in that space is not very great, you're not going to be able to reflect. The other aspect of it is that the LRV of the particular color of that tile that you're selecting. So if you really want to enhance that kind of look, imagine you selected the white color of these tiles, which is going to have a very high LRV, and then you're going to put that in a very well lit space. you're not going to really have an easy time seeing that rippled effect on these tiles. However, if you select a tile that has a lower LRV value, or the color, that has a lower LRV value of the tile. So in this case, this kind of like a darker green, they're both kind of, I would say, fall under the medium kind of LRV range. When the light reflects off these tiles, because they absorb some of that light in some parts of them, you're going to see, and that sort of that rippled effect is going to be seen way more in these particular situations. The other element is, for instance, the top right tile. You can see there is directional light coming from one side of the tile, and there's not a whole lot of light in that space. So here they've selected a kind of a polished tile with, it looks like it has very, very kind of very little bit of a texture to it. And what happens here is, because it's coming from one direction, you're going to see that pattern a lot better on the tile. And that's the kind of the feature you're trying to show with that tile. Otherwise, if you don't consider the lighting and how that affects the LRV, the lighting and the rippled effects on these tiles, if you don't consider these, you're not going to really enhance the space and what that potentially the tile can do to that space. So that's very important to look at. This is in this particular case study. The next case study here we're going to look at is the darker tones. And we saw one of those images earlier. And, one of the things you really want to consider is that when you cover a space with darker tiles, they are going to create a lot of shadows. And as a result, very important to put a lot of lighting coming in multiple directions. That's the key here with these, is it comes in multiple directions. Because what it'll do is that as a result of having tiles, light from multiple directions, you're not only going to eliminate shadows, too much shadows, which will be created because of the fact that the dark color tiles have a lower LRV, they can absorb more light, but also you're going to see the pattern on the tile much better as a result of that. So look at those nice golden veins on these particular tiles. You wouldn't be able to see these if the lighting wasn't so great in this space, and it would just look like some few dark tiles, and that would take away from the beauty of these tiles that originally was selected when when you were at the showroom and you're looking at it, you're like, oh, that's beautiful, I love this pattern, I want to see this pattern. So that's very important, is to, in reverse of that, let's say, if you don't have enough lighting, this is where you want to kind of consider, do I really want to put this tile in that space? Well, let me use it in a different space where actually I can see it, rather than in a space like where it's not going to be so great. And what's in that space is also very important. So you can see in that space here, everything, it looks like one of those custom showers where they kind of made everything out of the same tile. Well, there's really nothing else in that space other than the tile that, in terms of colors, that they can reflect off of. But in the left hand side, as you can see, there's a tub there, a white tub, which again, a white color is going to reflect a lot of light, so that can help with increasing the lighting in that space as well. So that's something to consider for when working with dark tiles. We talked a little bit about polished tiles earlier. Polished tiles are going to have, basically, they're high reflectance. So the LRV of any color that you're going to select for a polished tile is going to be automatically higher. And another thing to consider is there are polished tiles, and then there's something called luxe finished polished tiles. And the luxe finished polished tiles are even more polished than regular polished tiles. They're typically, manufacturers are typically in Italy or Spain, and it'll be categorized as a luxe finish. And these are going to have way more reflectance. So very important if you're working with, for instance, luxe finish, that you go for the off-whites rather than a pure white, because it's just going to look like a sea of white on the space. So in this particular picture, you can see it's a light colored beige tone, and they're using a highly reflective tile. I would imagine this is a luxe finish because you can kind of see everything is reflecting off this tile. Either it's super clean or it's a luxe finish tile. But in any case, you can see in the space, for instance, there is lighting, but it's really like not that crazy. You have pot lights there. They're super small pot lights. You have some perimeter light, and then you have some sconces that around that. But in terms of the amount of lighting in the space, is not a whole lot. But because they have right behind the TV, they have polished tiles. We have polished tiles on the floor. That's really reflecting a lot of light in that space. So they're compensating for that with the fact that they're putting polished tiles. So that's very important to consider as well. If you're putting tile in a space that's not going to have a lot of great lighting, selecting polished tile is the way to go, because you're going to add more light in that space versus a matte finish tile in this case. So LRV, in this case of tile, is going to really bounce between or increase or decrease based on polished or matte. Okay, so that's the next thing. And this is an example of what I'm talking about, that kind of super white, kind of monotone experience that you might be able to create. This is a situation where, there's a lot of light in the space, and they put this kind of white marble look effect tile on that space. And, this could be somebody's cup of tea. In my opinion, I think it makes the space a bit too bright, and you're not going to necessarily enjoy the space as much when it feels a little bit too, what's the word, chaotic in some ways. Maybe that's the right word, I don't know, but I just feel like it doesn't have a calming effect when the space is just too bright and you're looking down on a floor like that white. So that's something to consider. Again, LRV values of marble look tiles tend to be white, so you want to make sure that you understand how that's going to affect the lighting in the space. Another element quite important in the area of tile is the texture. We talked about ripples on ceramic tiles, but we have a lot of different textures on tiles. We have this 3D effects that we see. Some tiles are 3D effect tiles. Some of them are highly textured tiles, and they're designed that way to kind of mimic maybe natural stone, which in the industry quite a bit tries to create tiles that mimics that. So you have to understand that if you do have a lot of texture, or it's kind of the 3D effect on the tiles, that's going to impede the LRV value of that tile, because it's going to, what it's going to do is any light that is hits that surface is going to be reflected off in all directions, multiple random directions, instead of just coming right back in towards you. So that's going to reduce the LRV. So something of caution to consider, that in a space that you're going to be putting a tile that has a lot of texture, you want to increase the lighting even more than usual, because that, and also if you don't have a very well dim lit space, and you select tiles with not only the color of it being a low LRV, but also it's a 3D textured effect, you're not going to see the pattern very well. So you can kind of see, for instance, in that picture there, some areas are you're not really seeing very well because it's going to create shadows. And also the reverse is true too. If you have way too much lighting, you're not going to notice the texture very well. So there's this happy medium that you need to find, is not only having a decent amount of light in that space, but perhaps selecting an LRV of that tile that complements the lighting, where you can still see the pattern on the tile. That's really the whole point. You're trying to show off the tile to your customer by being able to capture the essence of everything that it has to offer. The texture, the color, the patterns, everything like that kind of ties in together. And the only way we're going to see it is you have a happy medium, happy balance in the LRV of everything that ties in together. So that's it for this episode. Thank you very much for listening and watching here. I hope you took away quite a bit from this. I am working on a PDF that put this all together, and maybe in the weeks to come, I will update you on how to get that. And but in the meantime, I do want to let you know that I have a book on Amazon, and you're more than welcome to check it out. Amazon US or Canada, you can type in Tile Confidential, and a lot of great information about tile and from a design and perspective as well in there as well, so you can check out. And so thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.